Welcome, quiet soul. You always hear what others miss. Today you are the listener history has been waiting for. The Tower of London, once an impenetrable fortress standing at the heart of England's capital, once the vault that cradled the crown jewels, was guarded so ruthlessly, so completely, that even the deepest corners of a person's conscience wouldn't dare hide a secret inside its walls. But if you think all it ever held was a throne, then perhaps you've never asked the real question. How many whispers can stone contain before it begins to crack? These walls have chilled to the echo of footsteps from nameless purges. They have listened without blinking to punishments crafted not in pursuit of justice but designed purely to breed fear. And sometimes, if you are still enough, if you wait long enough, you might just hear it. The scream that remains trapped inside the rock. By the 16th century, the tower had become a prison, a place where names once murmured behind palace doors vanished quietly and completely. They were not tried for justice but for politics, and no one who entered ever walked out whole. Executions unfolded like rituals. The condemned were hoisted backwards by ropes left dangling mid-air like puppets suspended in the palm of empire. Neck-strained tongues bulged, eyes pushed forward in agony, and death arrived slowly as though each final breath was being drawn out by an invisible hand, precise, unrelenting and cold. Even the nobility were not spared. Their only difference was the thin silk draped across their sentence, a veil too fragile to hide the fear underneath. Beheading was once considered an honour, the most noble way to die, a final courtesy reserved for aristocrats, but behind that illusion of dignity was a ritual so numbing, so ice-cold it left a scar deeper than the blade. The condemned had to pay their own executioner, and even after the coins were handed over, no one could promise them it would only take one blow. The tower's execution records still tell of heads that took 5 swings before parting from the neck. The axe, thick, brutal, weighty, came down not as if to sever, but to butcher. And after the final strike, the head was held aloft, a twisted gift for the crowd, a moment of savage spectacle they'd come to witness. Then it was taken across the river to London Bridge and skewered onto a wooden spike, a warning, carved not in stone but in skin, that treason against the crown would cost you your very face. To prolong the spectacle, they smeared the severed heads with pitch, coating the hair and skin in black tar to keep the rot at bay, but time always finds a way in. Birds circled above, then swooped, pecking flesh, tearing eyes, stripping away whatever piece of humanity still remained. They feasted not just on the body, but on the final flickering echo of what once lived, and the rest of the body left behind in the tower, buried beneath layers of stone. No headstone, no name. Only one thing remained, the chill, as if the tower had once known each of their names, but had chosen deliberately to forget them all. And if you believe that was the end of cruelty, then take one step further. Live disembowelment. Not a legend, not folklore. A very real form of execution once practiced on English soil, so barbaric that Queen Elizabeth herself eventually had to issue a royal command to end it. The last time it was carried out the year 1586, and the man behind it was no common butcher, but Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's right hand, her shadow in the corridors of the power, the man Europe only dared refer to by the name that sent a chill through every court and cloister, the spy master. Under his hand, England expanded its empire not through the blade, but through the ink, through coded messages and silent glances, and intelligence that bled. It was an age when every word might become evidence of treason, and silence itself could be interpreted as conspiracy. When Elizabeth established the Church of England, the Vatican did not stay quiet. A secret decree was passed. Every Catholic in Europe had a sacred duty to assassinate the Queen of England. From that moment the throne trembled. The gates of the tower slammed shut. The corridors sprouted ears, and in the storm of doctrine and rebellion, Elizabeth was left with one question. Who would protect a crowned woman walking alone through the darkness of holy war? The answer was Francis Walsingham, a man who terrified all of Europe because he could see a plot long before it took form. He moved through the tower as if each stone beneath his feet was listening to the rhythm of his pulse. He built a network without borders, without light, a network made not of soldiers but of watchers, eyes that never blinked and ears that perked at the sound of pouring wine or the whisper of ink on parchment. He taught himself, he observed. He constructed from scratch the first true foundations of British intelligence, a world where even a single nervous glance could become the thread that unravelled a kingdom. From smoky taverns to frostbitten courts, every breath became a code, and the job of those working in the dark was brutally simple: to strangle a threat before it ever learned to draw its first breath. Elizabeth understood all too well it would take just one spark, one moment for the crown to fall, and the one most likely to pick it up would be Mary Stuart, her cousin, the Queen of Scots. After a string of political scandals that left her reputation in ruins, Mary was forced to abandon her throne. With nowhere left to turn, she wrote to Elizabeth a letter pleading a final attempt to find sanctuary between two branches of royal blood. But England did not open its arms. The place she sought as refuge became her cage. The moment Mary set foot on English soil, she was arrested, not chained, but confined, not tortured, but moved again and again like a shadow that no house would claim. Every line of contact with the outside world was severed. Elizabeth was afraid. But Walsingham, he was certain one single letter slipping out could tilt the balance of all Europe. Mary was locked behind every door a kingdom could muster, and still Walsingham did not sleep. To him, this woman remained a hidden blade, a living danger sharp, and breathing too vivid to ignore a question history hadn't yet crossed out. And for a man like him, there was only one answer that could not be reversed. Mary Stuart must die. But there was one obstacle even he had not yet managed to overcome. Elizabeth, for all her armour, all her command of fleets and armies, was still a woman, and a woman still carries the weight of the heart. A weight for the cousin who once called her sister, a weight for the royal blood they shared, a weight for herself for what it would mean to take the life of someone who once looked to her with trust, with kinship. Elizabeth refused. To execute a fellow monarch was to her to carve a precedent too dangerous to bear. For if she allowed the beheading of a queen today, how could she ever be sure that her own crown wouldn't meet the same fate tomorrow? A single axe raised in the name of justice could plant fear in every throne that followed, but fate, as it often does, delivered the opportunity straight into the hands of the one man who had always believed that Mary Stuart's death was inevitable, Francis Walsingham. The man at the head of the intelligence network, the man who never wasted a single word, had found the key. A plot to overthrow the Queen had been uncovered, and every thread led straight back to the woman already imprisoned, Mary Queen of Scots. The intercepted letters revealed a name, Anthony Babington, a young Catholic nobleman, wealthy, devout, and so blindly devoted to Mary that his ink trembled like a prayer, desperate for a divine reply. But Babington did not know he had just written his own death sentence. Two of the men closest to him were Walsingham's spies, and every word he wrote, every meeting he planned, every secret he whispered, had already landed in the palm of the man who made Europe shudder. The Spy Master. Walsingham discovered that the group had been passing encrypted messages to Mary, some cloaked in intricate ciphers, but no secret survived more than a single night beneath the fingers of his decoding team. They worked in silence, nothing but the sound of ink bleeding into paper and the tight rhythm of hearts stretched thin with tension. And then the fatal letter emerged. Written by Babington's own hand, it pledged to rescue Mary, to restore Catholic rule, to overthrow Elizabeth, and to kill the Queen. All they lacked was one final thing, Mary's consent. Walsingham had everything, yet he did not act. He didn't just want Babington's head, he wanted Mary Stuart. So he did the unthinkable. He allowed the letter to reach her unmarked, untouched, as if no one had ever seen it. Mary sat before the page, her hand frozen above it, and in that moment she faced a choice. Inform Elizabeth, or join the plan to save her own life. Mary chose Babington, and in doing so she signed her own verdict. A nod to survive became the very thing that sealed her fate. As Walsingham waited in silence for Mary's reply, the web he had spun drew shut like iron wire. The Babington group's secret gathering was not some brilliant piece of last-minute espionage. It was the final act of a play Walsingham had scripted from the start, a clockwork trap now ready to lock. The moment the signal came through, Walsingham gave the order. Babington and his fellow conspirators were seized, snatched mid-thought, still convinced they were safely hidden. They had no idea that every step they took, every word they whispered, every plan they laid, had already been sitting neatly in the palm of the man feared across Europe for his gift of seeing plots before they ever breathed. And Mary still imprisoned, still writing letters, still believing. The hand on the other side was a friend reaching out. She didn't know all the men she was speaking to had already been captured. Yet in her reply she still wrote with the voice of someone who believed coordination was possible, who still held on to hope. Those lines, seemingly harmless, became the rope that tied her to a conspiracy. She was no longer a distant figure in the shadows. She had become a breathing piece on Walsingham's board. But for a man like him, that still wasn't enough. Mary had never written the words, "I consent to the Queen's assassination." And that was the one flaw in the indictment, the one truth he couldn't bend. So he created the truth. A postscript was added to the letter, written in forged handwriting, placed in just the right spot with just the right tone so no one would ever question its origin. It was a masterstroke of deception, the perfect stitch. The rescue plea became a confession. The captive queen became the silent mastermind. That letter, part truth, part fabrication, was laid before Elizabeth. And when her eyes reached the end, the page in her hand was no longer paper. It was a blade to the heart, the final blow to any trace of trust, the bell that shattered all hesitation and rang straight into the soul of a woman who had once called Mary her sister in blood. Elizabeth remembered every pause, every dinner where no word was said aloud, the long years of restraint wearing mercy like a shield. But now laid bare before her, there was nothing left except for a decision she could never take back. And if she could not bring herself to do what had to be done, then Walsingham would do it for her in a way history would never wash clean. While Mary still sat writing letters, her co-conspirators had already been tried and condemned for treason. And for that crime, the punishment was never in question. Elizabeth signed, and as always she chose the harshest form of execution, not to kill but to send a message. On the morning of September 26, 1586, 7 men were led from the tower into the thick mist of an early winter dawn, where the darkness hanging in the air was heavier than the sentence awaiting them. They were hanged not to die swiftly, but to dangle between breath and blackness, to choke on the slow terror that separates life from death before being pulled down, forced awake only to watch their companions cut open before their eyes, each red coil of intestine tossed into the flames, as if life itself were the only thing on public trial. They were not allowed to faint, not allowed to turn away, not allowed to close their eyes. Their consciousness was part of the sentence, and their fear, that was the tickle the Empire demanded. But the execution ground could no longer contain its own horror. Revulsion spread, public outrage surged, and Elizabeth was forced to order an end to this barbarity. The remaining men were hanged quickly, without disembowelment, without fire, without the nightmare dragging on 1 moment longer. And then it was Mary's turn. Once the queen of an independent nation, Mary rejected the authority of England's court, denied all involvement in plotting Elizabeth's murder, but admitted she had planned to escape, and every word she spoke came far too late. On February 8, 1587, Mary Stuart was led to the scaffold, and with a single stroke of the axe, the conspiracy to dethrone the Queen of England came to its close. But the victor was not Elizabeth, not the Church. It was the man who never stepped into the light, Francis Walsingham, the hidden architect of a new kind of warfare, one built not on force but on icy intellect. Relentless suspicion and an unshakable belief that if the goal was great enough, then every method, no matter how silent, how unseen, was justified. His weapons were not swords or spears, but ciphered codes, letters, written in lemon juice, pinpricks hidden within pages, and invisible ink that only revealed itself under flame like the voice of darkness returning from the past. And even 300 years later that ink would still be used. Walsingham's world of codes didn't live solely on paper. There were secrets wrapped around wooden cylinders, lines of writing that only revealed their meaning when coiled in just the right way, and when misaligned unravelled into nothing more than a chaos of senseless symbols no one could decipher. For him, deciphering wasn't a parlour game. It was a chess match where national survival could turn on a single wrong word or a letter misplaced. But Walsingham didn't just play chess with ink, he played it with people. Among his invisible agents, one name stood out. Christopher Marlowe, poet, playwright, and a ghostly figure in Elizabeth's shadow, were a man who walked the razor's edge between art and espionage, where every play might be the curtain draped over a mission no one was allowed to name. Then on a night in late May 1593, Marlowe was seen drinking with 3 men, all linked to the Babington plot. By morning, he was found motionless on the floor, his throat slashed so deep it was as if the killer feared he might still speak. No one was arrested, no one convicted, and that death, like so many truths inside Walsingham's web, vanished as if it had never happened at all. Today, a stone statue of Marlowe stands silently outside the theatre in Canterbury, where he says nothing, neither confirming nor denying, only the stories still whisper through time that some secrets were buried with him but never truly went to sleep. And the Tower of London, once the epicentre of all that shadow, now holds only its stones, and the footsteps of millions of visitors who come to take pictures, to gaze at crowns, to chuckle gently when a tour guide tells tales of beheadings, as if recounting an old fairy tale. Until one day in 1991, among a crowd quietly exiting the courtyard after a guided tour, A middle-aged woman stepped toward the guide. She asked a single question softly, but with enough weight to lodge itself in the ear of everyone nearby. "Can you show me where they shot my father?" That question, brief and breathless, opened a door that history had long held shut in silence. A story never printed in the guidebooks, never mapped for tourists to find. The story of the last man ever executed within the Tower of London. His name was Joseph Jacobs, a German spy, caught while trying to broadcast navigational signals to Luftwaffe bombers flying above British skies during World War II. The German Air Force needed constant updates on British weather, the kind that shifted by the hour, sometimes by the minute, and the fastest, most accurate way to gather that intelligence was through covert agents already stationed on enemy soil. The job demanded experience, training, and unwavering loyalty. But Joseph Jacobs had none of those things. He wasn't an intelligence officer. He was a dentist, a maxillofacial doctor thrown into the chaos of a world war he never asked to enter. He had fought once in the First World War, and then at age 42, just as life seemed to be quieting into routine, a recall order arrived. But this time, due to some strange clerical error, Joseph Jacobs was not sent back to the medical corps. He was reassigned to German military intelligence. His training lasted 3 weeks, no tradecraft, no escape drills, just a few lessons on radio use and weather reporting. To his superiors, he was just a pawn, expendable, replaceable, a shadow meant to move and, if necessary, to vanish. On a January night in N41, he drifted into British airspace carrying a suitcase with a hidden radio, a map of airfields, forged papers and a pistol, the luggage of a man walking into hell with no map to get back out. And from the very first moment it went wrong. Jacobs, who had never learned how to parachute, hit the ground hard, his ankle snapping under him with the pain that shot up his spine like a blade. He crawled in the darkness, trying to find cover, only to stumble upon the wife of a farmer, stepping out to open the cowshed. She screamed, and he, frozen, starving, desperate, pulled the gun not to shoot but to scare her. It didn't work. Defeated, he dragged himself back toward the crumpled parachute, trembling alone, shivering in the fog, and raised his pistol to the sky, not to take his life but to call for help. Anyone. A farmer heard the gunshot. He followed the sound and found a man collapsed beside torn silk breath flickering like it was fading into the soil. Joseph Jacobs, dentist, recalled soldier reluctant spy, was captured that way. When they took him in, he claimed he wasn't a spy. Perhaps he thought the British would pity him. Perhaps he believed a lie well spoken could save a life. But truth does not wait for persuasion. It was already in his coat pocket, a fully loaded Luger, a radio transmitter with a live battery, forged identity papers, and a map clearly marking 2 British military airfields. His ankle was so badly shattered that soldiers had to carry him on a stretcher. He was taken to London and transferred to a top-secret military prison, the kind where saboteurs were tried in silence and never seen again. There Jacobs told his story that he was Luxembourgish, that he had helped Jews escape, that he had once been sent to a concentration camp for opposing the Nazis. Jacobs claimed that spying had been merely a pretext, a desperate excuse to escape hell, that he was part of the resistance, not a Nazi. It sounded like a story meant to stir sympathy, but it was nothing more than a script, a rehearsed tale memorized by German agents long before their missions ever began. Further investigation uncovered a different man, one who had demanded obscene amounts of money to help Jews escape. His military registry confirmed he was German. Swiss police records revealed that in 1924 Jacobs had served time for dealing counterfeit gold. The final verdict was declared execution as a spy and a saboteur. Ordinarily, he would have been hanged inside the prison like so many before him. But with his ankle shattered beyond standing, Joseph Jacobs was granted a firing squad. There was just one problem: the prison had no firing squad. And so, in a twist that felt less like logistics and more like fate, the man who had limped into the spy game was brought back to the place that had once held traitors, the Tower of London. On August 15th, 1941, at precisely 7 in the morning, a rattling truck creaked through the stone corridors of the ancient fortress. Inside, Jacobs sat with eyes closed, his face the colour of ash. The vehicle halted at an indoor firing range hidden along the tower's outer wall. He was carried out. A soldier silently pinned a small white target over his chest where the heart still beat. Behind the worn wooden chair they stacked straw waiting to absorb the bullets. Jacobs was tied down. A British officer stepped forward, removed his glasses and pulled the black hood over his head, like the curtain falling on a stage no audience would ever applaud. Then 6 soldiers from the Scots Guards entered in step-heavy wordless. In their hands were Springfield rifles, cold and clean, no screaming, no noise, just barrels aimed quietly at the man who had once tried to guide enemy planes from the ground below. By tradition, only 5 of the rifles were loaded with live rounds. The 6th always carried a blank, a silent mercy, a final deception, so that each soldier could walk away believing, even if only in silence, maybe it wasn't my bullet that killed him. At 7:12 a.m, the order was given. The commander's voice rang out short, cold, like a blade brushing across the neck of steel. 6 Springfield rifles cracked in unison, shattering the heavy silence that lay like stone-laced fog. Joseph Jacobs' failed dentist, failed spy, collapsed. He became the last man, the final condemned soul to be executed within the Tower of London. The wooden chair in which he sat is still preserved to this day. Somewhere deep in a vault coated in dust, steeped in the scent of dried blood and gunpowder, it waits. It looks like nothing more than a medieval instrument of torture. Perhaps they stored it away, not out of fear that history might forget, but because the present could no longer bear the memory it carried. And yet not everyone imprisoned in the tower left by way of no return. There was a man, also a spy, also accused of treason, who did not die. In fact, he lived as an honoured guest, with wine, with books, with a reputation that gleamed in the very empire that once tried to kill him. And most remarkable of all, he was the only American ever held within the Tower of London. The year was 1780. America's war for independence was burning from the forests of Virginia to the blood-rusted docks of Boston. Henry Laurens, former president of the Continental Congress, had been entrusted with a secret mission. He was to cross the Atlantic and negotiate support from Europe for the American revolutionary cause. A bold mission, and as fate would have it, a voyage never meant to reach its end. His small ship hugged the shoreline, trying to evade the gaze of the Royal Navy. But as the fog lifted, it revealed what might as well have been a curse etched into the sea, a British warship towering and inescapable. Soldiers stormed the deck. Laurens, in a last desperate moment, hurled his leather case into the ocean, flinging his hopes into the undertow. He believed the water would bury his secrets, but the sea is not always neutral. A British sailor saw it, hauled it in and brought it aboard. Hours later, the mask of diplomacy was stripped away. Henry Laurens, an ambassador en route to the Netherlands, carrying agreements of alliance for the American colonies, was declared a collaborator of the enemy. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London and made to pay for every flame that warmed his bones, every meal on his plate, every guard's wages, even the very key that locked his own cell. But sometimes justice doesn't arrive through the front gate. It slips quietly through the heart of a girl on the cusp of womanhood. Elizabeth Vernon, daughter of the warden, raised among stone walls and the clatter of chains, yet bearing within her a quiet fire that whispered one word: America. She longed to meet the man, Henry Laurens, living symbol of a cause her father called treason. And no one imagined that within those frostbitten halls and forbidden glances, a bond would quietly take root. One old one, young one caged, one free bound not by chains but by something no empire had the power to command. Elizabeth was drawn to the steady, unbowed gaze of Laurens. She helped him smuggle letters to American sympathisers in the British press, hiding them in her dress, slipping past the very guards commanded by her own father, who never knew he was guarding a revolution. From his icy cell, Laurens began to write letters, essays, declarations, words that seeped beyond the stone, reaching the political salons of London. The nobility came as if to glimpse a prophet. Some came for conviction, some for curiosity, and some for love. 15 months passed. Washington forced Britain's surrender. Henry Laurens was released. Before he could return home, a letter arrived from Franklin summoning him to Paris to join the delegation negotiating peace. From prisoner in chains, he now sat at the table reading aloud the terms that the British crown would be forced to sign. And history in its cruel poetry smiled. Henry Laurens, once branded a traitor, once billed for firewood in a dungeon, now stood as the first US ambassador to London, greeted with honours and fanfare. The British aristocracy gave him a name, half mocking, half reverent: Tower Laurens, Laurens of the Tower. During his 18-month tenure as ambassador, he often returned to that old prison, not to recall the shackles, but to see Elizabeth again. In 1786, Henry Laurens left England and returned to America, carrying with him a memory no one in his family could ever fully touch. 6 years later, he passed away, leaving behind a portion of his estate to a young woman who had once walked the cold stone corridors of the Tower of London just to press a fragment of his letter close to her heart. Nearly 130 years later, the Tower would claim another man, this one knighted by the Empire, only to be swallowed whole by its oldest fortress. His name was Roger Casement, a sharp-witted diplomat, a convicted traitor, a man who carried within him a secret one more dangerous than treason itself. Throughout his diplomatic career, Casement quietly investigated the farthest corners of empire in Africa, in South America, uncovering the buried wounds left behind by so-called civilization, torture, enslavement, forced labour. His reports shook Europe's conscience, and Britain knighted him, holding him up as a paragon of imperial virtue. But when he left public service, Casement wrote no memoir, held no lectures, basked in no legacy. He returned to Ireland and chose a path more perilous than any battlefield he had ever crossed. He would fight for his nation's independence. When the Great War erupted, Britain postponed its promise of Irish self-rule. Casement would wait no longer. He went to America to raise funds, then reached out in secret to Germany, Britain's enemy, proposing a rebellion from within. In a quiet Washington hotel room, Casement made his pitch: an Irish-German alliance, weapons shipments, an uprising timed for Easter, a stab to the Empire's back with bullets' blood and the breathless thirst for freedom. The Germans agreed. Casement was granted access to prisoner-of-war camps, hoping to recruit Irishmen who had once served in the British Army. But harsh reality soon caught up. Few volunteered. The promised weapons were outdated, rusted relics unworthy of trust. Still, the plan moved forward. A ship carrying arms left port. A submarine was ordered to slip Casement onto Irish shores, a ghost bearing both ideals and despair. On Good Friday 1916, Roger Casement set foot on the cold grey shores of his homeland, not to lead a rebellion but to stop it. He knew with chilling certainty if the rising went forward, no one would survive. But what he didn't know was that British intelligence had already uncovered the plan. The ship carrying weapons intercepted. The full manifest compromised. And Casement, walking through wet grass and rain-soaked winds, carried enough evidence in his coat to damn a dozen men. Just hours after landing, he was arrested. On him, a German train ticket, the name of the arms ship, and a full list of the cargo. No interrogation needed. Casement was shackled, transported to the Tower of London, and charged with treason. On Easter Sunday, just as planned, the uprising ignited in Dublin. Though outgunned, the Irish rebels seized key buildings and declared independence. British troops stormed in, and the rebellion brave broken was crushed. Meanwhile, Casement, once knighted by the Crown, sat in a cold stone cell in the Tower of London, awaiting his final sentence. But then, public opinion turned. The government released private diaries, pages scrawled with Roger Casement's most intimate confessions, his sexual encounters with men, his deep desires for young soldiers, for men of colour. The diaries were never submitted in court, but they didn't need to be. They weren't meant to prove treason. They were meant to strip away his dignity. Casement was hanged. But he never begged, never pleaded, never recanted. He said only this: loyalty is a sentiment, not a law. And when that sentiment no longer lies with an empire that crushes your homeland, then fighting for freedom cannot be a crime. And in that moment the world shifted. They expected to find codes, orders from Berlin, lists of foreign agents. They found something more dangerous. Lines of raw desire. A hunger for flesh. Young men, brown skin, a record not of espionage but of love the empire considered diseased, not evidence of treason, but proof that Roger Casement had loved men. The British government held the most effective weapon against compassion. They released copies of the Black Diaries to the press, to the churches, even to the very leaders of the Irish rebellion. There was no need for a public execution. They only had to plant one word: homosexual, and that was enough to ensure Roger Casement would die alone. When advised to plead insanity to avoid death, he refused, because to die a rebel meant history might still remember you, but to live as a pervert meant being erased forever. August 3rd, 1916. Roger Casement stepped onto the gallows in the inner courtyard of the Tower of London. The priest who accompanied him would later say he died with the dignity of a prince. And the stone walls still stand, silent keepers of centuries of betrayal, of names struck from history, of truths buried under dust and doctrine. But if you listen closely, truly listen, between the wind slipping through the cold stone cracks, you might hear a breath that never quite finished, a secret still breathing. You've just heard the story of Sir Roger Casement, the last knight to step out of the light. And if something in your heart stirred, something you can't quite name, come back to us as we uncover the forgotten pages of history. Sleep gently tonight. And if you dream of truths that were never allowed to be spoken.